may get rowdy. I heard it gets rowdy in here at 11:15. So I don't know. The 9 a.m. people said, we don't know if they even come to worship anymore. And then we think it gets crazy. So anyway, they didn't say any of that. I made it all up, but wasn't it fun? So my name's Justin Gottlieb. It's a great privilege to be here. I was saying earlier how much of a joy it is to be with you, because for over 15 years we've been praying and dreaming about this church, about the people of God here growing together as disciples of Jesus and helping other people meet Him. And so it's an honor and a great joy from my heart to get to be here and to see you. So thanks for having me. My wife and I have 4 kids. One of them's here today, Finn. He's over here. He's awesome. He's a lot of fun. And just a really cool kid. And and anyway, it's been a joy getting to hang out with him this weekend. But we have 3 others. So my daughter's 11, and then 2 little savages that are 5 and 4. And Finn asked me to make it really clear that they're total and complete savages. So that's for you, buddy, and it's on tape. So anyway, a few years ago, it became clear that my children enjoyed playing soccer, and this strange sport would be part of our lives in the coming years. And so I decided that it was a time for me to start learning the game. And to do that, one to help them get better at it, right? Because I feel like if we're going to play, we need to win. And that's just a philosophy of life. I'm not saying it's gospel, but I'm saying Jesus wins, so work with me there. So secondly, if we're going to be like our king, so we want to do that. So anyway, secondly, it was a way for me to invest in my relationship with my kids. And so one Saturday morning, we turned on English Premier League game, and which is what you're supposed to do, I think, to learn, and that and a lot of YouTube and other stuff. And so we turned that on, and immediately we were confronted with this question from one of the kids, which was, who are we cheering for? So living in Boston, the kids don't usually have to ask that question because they know who they're supposed to cheer for. And the questions are much more like, is there going to be room in the trophy case for another championship, right? Like, I know you guys don't get it, but I'm telling you, there's another way. There's another way. And, we have to worry about, so is this year's championship t-shirt going to, clash with last year's? There's lots of stuff. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's not your fault. We can tell you more about the struggles. But anyway, in this moment, we decided, based on an incredibly sophisticated and complex analytical formula of whose uniforms are best, to support Manchester United. That's how we decided. And on this day, the sun was shining in Manchester, which it doesn't usually do. And there were these beautiful red shirts and white shorts, and we just decided we were going to pull for them. And that was great. And some of you will care about that because you'll resonate. And some of you are like, I don't care what you're talking about. That's okay. I'm all right with that. But I'm a complete nerd. So it wasn't long before I was not only watching the games, but I'm reading the Manchester newspapers because, like I said, I'm a nerd. And we're watching more and more games. And soon we realized that there were a few things that set this club apart from the rest of the clubs. One is this love for homegrown players. And 2 was an expectation that they would not only win the league, but also compete for the biggest European trophies. And of course, a lot of teams desire these things. But these are especially crucial to the culture of United fans. And here's why. Back in 1958, the team was clicking, and they were young, and they were local, comprised of local kids. And they had just secured a semifinal spot in the European Cup, which was the biggest of all the competitions. And they were on their way to winning this thing, being the first English team to do so. And the future was bright for them. And on February 6, 1958, an airplane carrying Manchester United's team home from a European Cup match crashed in Munich. And with it, so many of the club's dreams. 23 people died in the crash, including 7 players. And there's so much more to that story. Why were they flying in a snowstorm? Why were they the first English team to really emphasize winning the European Cup? There's a lot there. We don't have to dive into all that right now. I'm simply telling you that to help you see that the story of the Munich air disaster has shaped who the club is today. It's shaped who the club is today. It's shaped the songs that are sung at the stadium. It's shaped the words and images on the banners that hang in the stadium. And it's shaped the lives of players who weren't there at the time or weren't even alive at the time. It's even shaped the definition of success for the club. And I knew a little bit of this a few years back. But it wasn't until my wife and I spent a day at Old Trafford, the stadium, getting to watch a home game and going through the museum that it really clicked. And it clicked because we were, in one moment, in a room full of trophies. More trophies than you can imagine. And that's not just because you live here. Like, it was literally a lot of trophies. It was a lot. All right, so that's in one room. And you take a step over into another room, and in this room is all these photos and all these memories of this moment, of this air disaster. And you realize that these two things go together. And it's really hard to see them, but they go together. So as we took this in, you begin to understand more and more about the club. And as you hear the story, you begin to understand why fans 60 years later are so passionate. Not only for their team to be successful, of course, every team is that. But that's not enough. The team needs to be local. It needs to play in a certain attacking manner. It needs to win the biggest of trophies, or it's not a success. And see, I'm telling you all this because, and you'll know this from a lot of other stuff, because this is a great example of how story shapes who we are. Story shapes who we are. And it's not only true of a soccer club, a continent away from where we sit today, but it's true of each of us. See, much of who we are is driven by the stories that we identify with, and we, in turn, behave in certain ways. We develop certain rhythms and routines, and we invest in certain ways based on stories. And this is true of Apple users, right? The misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in square holes. See, Apple has leveraged that story into becoming the biggest company in the world. See, it's true of coffee drinkers. Whether you're into Keurig, who may have the lamest slogan ever, my taste, my style, my Keurig. Right? Not my marketing department, but regardless. And like, if you're into that Keurig story and you're dedicated to trying to waste the tiniest bit of effort possible making your coffee, then that's you, right? Or maybe you're into Dunkin' Donuts. That's my wife, by the way, so I said it to her face, so I'll say it to yours. If you're into Dunkin' Donuts, right? In Boston, that's the thing, right? I'm not going to say anymore. Folks flip their iced coffee upside down while shaking it, so all the sugar mixes in. It's weird, it's risky, whatever. That's a story, right? America runs on Dunkin'. Or maybe you're into that third wave, single origin, pour over, that you research. Some people are resonating right now, they just don't want to acknowledge it. And you have it shipped from various roasters around the country because you, my friend, just get coffee in a deeper way. Right? Story shapes who we are. Story shapes our actions. Story shapes what's important to us. Because we're wired for story. We're wired for it. The thing is, all the stories I've mentioned so far let us down. See, Manchester United disappoints me regularly. Yet my family, we got gear and we watch games. My iPhone must be charged. I got to the hotel last night and realized I didn't have a charger, right? It will let me down. And it will stop working every few years so that I replace it. Right? Coffee gets cold, or iced coffee gets warm, and it stops tasting good. So you got to make another cup. As it turns out, none of those things truly satisfy, not a one of them. But I've identified with the story, right? You've identified with the story. So we keep watching the game, upgrading the phone, ordering the coffee. And if none of those stories resonate with you, then I can promise you have another story. Even if your story is a story of not identifying with other stories, right? And that other story will still let you down. But stories, even when they're lesser stories that let us down, they shape who we are and they shape what we do. But there is one story that hits a lot different than others. And there's a story that is for our good always. So if you will, flip over to Deuteronomy 6 with me. You may already be there. I say flip or tap or whatever. Or these guys that are awesome serving in the back are going to have it up on the screen too in a little bit. But when I get there, because I'm like prepping you, I'm telling you I'm going to read scripture, then I'm going to talk for another minute. Makes me feel like I'm stopping talking, but I'm really just keeping on. So we're going to start reading that, and here's the setting of it. God has freed his people, Israel, from the oppressive rule of Pharaoh. Awesome, right? God used a man, Moses, to lead his people out of Egypt and has moved miraculously throughout that process, including plagues, turning a river to blood and parting the sea so that his people could escape Pharaoh's army. That's all happened. And even with God's clear presence and clear leading, his people had times of unfaithfulness to him. And that led to a time of wandering through the desert for 40 years on the way to the promised land. In Deuteronomy, Moses is retelling their story, and where we pick up today, he's been telling them what they need to do, what they need to hear and do, so that things may go well with them, so that they will walk in the blessing of God in the promised land. So that's what's going on. Now we're actually going to read. Deuteronomy 6:20. Starts off, when your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? So Moses is saying, when your son asks. Now we're going to talk about why he's going to ask. All right. In the verses before this, Moses has told God's people that there is one God. One. And he is our God. Sorry, I did that first time too, and here we go. I'm not smart. So, one God, and he's our God. Because of this, we are to love him with all of our heart, soul, and strength. And his words, the commands that Moses is sharing, shall be on their hearts. Because there's one God, that's what we're supposed to do. And then Moses tells them this. This is back in verse 7. You don't have to flip back there, but he says, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Moses is telling God's people that God has transformed their lives, and that their lives should look different than they did before. The reality of who God is and what he has done should be a topic of conversation with their children. Who God is and what he has done and what that means for them should be talked about in their homes and as they walk on the road and when they are waking in the morning and when they're going to sleep in the evening. Essentially, Moses is communicating that God's character and God's commands should be reflected in every area of life. Every area of life. Even to the point that they should have scripture near them always. And there are to be visible reminders when they're entering homes and entering their cities that God is in fact their God and that they are his people. It's with this context that Moses voices this expectation and this assumption in verse 20 that a son will ask, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? Moses is assuming that God's people are living in a particular way that would cause their children to ask, not with attitude, not with sarcasm, not with the poor spirit, but the kids to ask, why do we live in these certain ways? See, it assumes that the kids have enough exposure to the faith. It assumes that they have enough of an exposure to gospel-driven rhythms in their lives that a son would have a question. And for the Israelites, their lives were built so that remembrance of God wouldn't be missed. See, there were festivals, there was religious worship, there was the Sabbath day, right? Like life was built so it wouldn't be missed. And we too, as a people transformed by the good news of Jesus, should also be building lives in this way. Lives showing devotion to the Lord. Lives displaying his forgiveness of us by the way we forgive others. Right? Lives displaying God's generosity to us by being generous to God and to others. In fact, how much more should we take this serious on this side of the cross? Let's make sure our lives are built in ways that scream, we are God's people. Let's do that too. Let's build our lives so that the transformative work of God will not be missed. Now, Moses tells them how to answer the question the son asks in verse 21 through 23, which is great, right? Because there's not a parenting handbook, but it's really helpful when Moses just says, when your son asks this, say this. I like that, right? It beats the heck out of going on YouTube to learn how to change the oil. So verse 21 to 23. Then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders, great and grievous, against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household, before our eyes. And he brought us out from there, that he might bring us and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. So when kids ask about faith, Moses says, let's be ready to tell them the story of why we live in obedience to God. Let's tell them that story early and often. That's what Moses is getting at here. God's people should be clear that they were in Egypt living as slaves under Pharaoh. They were. That's the story. They were in a very hopeless and oppressive situation. Yet God moved mighty, with signs and with wonders. God moved against Pharaoh and Pharaoh's household in ways that were visible, in ways that were felt deeply, in ways that were crushing physically, and in ways that were devastating emotionally. And God did all of that to bring his people out of Egypt. Not simply so they could meander around. God did all of that so that he could bring them out of slavery and into the land he had promised to their fathers. God had made covenant with his people and was fulfilling promises as he freed his people. See, Moses is calling parents to be clear with their children about who God is. The all-powerful, covenant-keeping, land-giving Lord of all who defeated Pharaoh in devastating fashion. This is our God. He heard our prayers. He heard our weeping. He saw our circumstance. And he flexed his muscles to fulfill the promise he made. God wouldn't allow it to be otherwise. And no earthly power, not one, could stand in his way. Though he tried, Pharaoh was no match for the Lord, who could not only split the sea, but is the very one who created it and upholds it. And like them, we too were living under terrible circumstances, enslaved to sin and hopeless. Yet God heard prayers. God saw our circumstance. And God sent Jesus for his people. He wouldn't allow any earthly power to stand in the way. And it turns out that Satan, sin, and death are no match for our Lord. This is the story. This is God's story. This is our story. It's mine. It's yours. And it's changed everything. We are slaves no more. We're headed to the promised land. Let's keep going in verse 24 and 25. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God, for our good always, that he might preserve us alive, as we are this day, and it will be righteousness for us if we are careful to do all this commandment before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us. Because of all that God is, all that God has done and all that God is doing, God has commanded us to obey his commands because he is who he is. Because he's always good, right, and perfect. And because he knows what's best for us, we obey his commands. In fact, it's hard to imagine when you hear this story and begin to take it in and to believe it. It's hard to imagine not responding to his grace with adoration, with love, and obedience. You can see and feel why one writer in Proverbs would say, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. As a parent, we can say to our kids, we've seen this God be powerful. We've seen him be good. How else can we respond to God's commands? But even then, catch this. The reason we want to obey is not just that God has been good to us in the past, but that he is, I hope you caught it in there, always for our good. See, God is for our good always. Look at what Moses says in verse 24. The Lord commanded us to do all these statutes for our good always, that he might preserve us alive. I'm going to read it again because it's so crucial. And this is actually if I could tell you one thing, this is what it is. This is what I wanted to come down here for. The Lord commanded us to do all these statutes for our good always. For our good always. That he might preserve us alive. That's the one thing I want to tell you. God's commands aren't just for his sake. They're for ours. It's so easy to get this twisted in our world that tells us all kinds of stuff is good for us. It tells us ease is better for us. It tells us chasing that thing for joy, for satisfaction is good for us. But it's God that is for our good always. He's for his people always. He's for your good always. He's for my good always. The Heidelberg Catechism goes so far as to say that all things must work together for my salvation. And they just copied the Apostle Paul. Now, of course, our understanding of what's good may collide in the moment. But it's never because of God's inadequacy. It's never because of God's lack of love for us. It's never because of God's lack of intent. It's never because of God's lack of ability to pull things off for us. See, when and where we either want to deviate from obeying God or trusting God, it's because we, not he, don't understand what is good for us. See, our lack of understanding does not signal lack of understanding from God. So in the context of Deuteronomy, we could even say it like this. We could list some things from the Ten Commandments here. He's for our good when he commands us to have no other gods before him. He's for our good then. He's for our good when he commands us not to steal. He's for our good when he commands us not to murder. He's for our good when he commands us to not commit adultery. He's for our good when he commands us not to covet. God is for our good when all around our soul gives way. He's for our good always. Always. None of those other stories I talked about earlier end this way. See, Manchester United may have an intriguing story, but they're for my good only so far as I make them money. Apple may have an inspiring story, but they're only for you to the point that you upgrade your phone and laptop. Your favorite coffee dealer is only for you so far as you place the next order. And every story is that way, except for one. For this one. Which is why we've got to tell this story to our own hearts over and over. It's why we got to tell this story to our kids over and over. And it's why we've got to tell it to our not yet believing friends over and over and over. 7 Mile Road, God is for our good always. This can be so simple, but we can make it so hard. So simple, but we can make it so hard. Parents, wear out those storybook Bibles, reading them to your kids. Not just for them, but for you too. When it's worn out, tape it together. Read it again till you wear it out again. Then buy a new one. Tell God's story from breakfast to bedtime. Tell it to your husband. Tell it to your wife. Tell it to your family members. Tell it to your neighbors. Tell it to your coworkers. Tell God's story with your words, but tell it with your forgiveness when you're betrayed. Tell God's story with your generosity. Tell God's story with love for your neighbor who does not love you at all. See, let's teach ourselves and our kids that when God commands us, He does so for our good always, and never for our worst, never for our demise, but for our thriving and for our joy. God is for our good always. And never is that more clear than when Jesus came to free us. Not from the oppressive rule of Pharaoh, but from the penalty for our sin. Never is it more clear that He is for our good always than when the perfect, sinless Christ took on humanity and lived a perfect life, only to die a perfect death, bleeding on the cross, so that we could be free. And never will it be more clear than when Jesus comes back and puts away sin and death and pain forever. Never will it be more clear. There's so much good news for us in these words today that I just don't want us to miss it. You and I, we've failed God's commands. He's been good to us, but we've fallen short. I don't have to name all that. You know it. I know it. We failed Him. Yet He is for our good always. Even to the point of giving His Son. And nothing could ever change that. Let's believe Him. Let's do that. God is for your good always. Pray with me. God, I thank You. I thank You that You're for our good always. We don't deserve it. We deserve far from good from You. But You, Lord, are for our good. You just are. It's who You are. It's not an act. It's not a part of the time thing. It's an always thing. And I pray that You would help us to grasp that reality and to live as Your people, believing that truth, and proclaiming it in everything that we do, so that what You've done to us is happening through us to others, so that they too could come along in believing this story. Would You please make it so for the good of Your people and for the glory of Your name? Amen.